It was just a 1902 family portrait. But look closer at the mother's hand and you'll see a dark secret. The photograph had been forgotten for nearly a century, tucked away in a cardboard box in the attic of a modest home in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. It was discovered in 2018 by Marcus Jefferson, a 42-year-old high school history teacher who had returned to his grandmother's house to help sort through her belongings after she passed away. The summer heat was oppressive, and dust particles floated in the narrow beams of light that pierced through the attic's single window. Marcus wiped sweat from his forehead as he opened box after box, finding old letters, faded receipts, and clothing that smelled of mothballs and time. Then he found it, a formal family portrait from 1902, preserved in a cracked leather frame. The photograph showed 5 people, a man and woman seated in the center, flanked by 3 children of varying ages. They were dressed in their finest clothes, the kind worn only for special occasions. The man wore a dark suit with a crisp white shirt, his expression serious and dignified. The woman beside him had her hair pulled back tightly, her dress simple but immaculate. The children stood stiffly, their faces betraying a mix of pride and nervousness. It was a portrait of respectability, of a family asserting their place in a world that constantly tried to deny it. Marcus stared at the photograph, feeling an unexpected tightness in his chest. He had seen old family pictures before, but there was something about this one that held his attention. The faces were familiar in a way he couldn't quite explain, as though he were looking at echoes of his own features reflected back through time. He wondered who these people were, whether they were his direct ancestors, and what their lives had been like in New Orleans at the turn of the century, a time when being black in the Deep South meant navigating a landscape of violence, humiliation, and systematic oppression. He carried the photograph downstairs and placed it on the kitchen table, wiping the glass carefully with a soft cloth. As he cleaned away decades of grime, the image became clearer, sharper. The woman's eyes seemed to look directly at him as though she had something urgent to say. Marcus noticed her hands folded neatly in her lap. One hand rested over the other, but there was something about the way her fingers were positioned, something deliberate, almost protective. He leaned closer, squinting in the afternoon light. That's when he saw it. The skin on her right hand was marked, scarred in a way that didn't match the careful dignity of the rest of the portrait. The lines were deep, uneven, and unmistakably deliberate. Marcus felt his breath catch. What had happened to this woman, and why had she chosen to be photographed with those scars visible? Marcus couldn't stop thinking about the photograph. That evening, he sat at his kitchen table with a magnifying glass, examining every inch of the woman's hand. The scars were clearly visible now, raised, textured marks that ran across her palm and the back of her hand in irregular patterns. They weren't the result of an accident. They looked intentional, repeated, like something inflicted over time. His stomach turned as the implications settled in. He had taught about slavery and Reconstruction in his classes for years, but seeing physical evidence of brutality on his own ancestor's body felt different. It wasn't abstract anymore. It wasn't a paragraph in a textbook or a statistic in a lecture. It was real, personal, and it demanded answers. The next morning, Marcus took the photograph to his colleague, Dr. Evelyn Torres, a professor of African American history at Louisiana State University. They had worked together on several community history projects, and he trusted her expertise. Evelyn's office was filled with books, framed photographs of civil rights leaders, and stacks of research papers. She looked up from her desk as Marcus entered, her expression shifting to curiosity when she saw what he was carrying. "I need you to look at something," Marcus said, placing the photograph on her desk. Evelyn adjusted her reading glasses and leaned in, her eyes scanning the image carefully. She was silent for a long moment, her finger hovering over the glass without touching it. "Where did you find this?" she asked quietly. "My grandmother's attic. I think it's from 1902, maybe New Orleans." Evelyn nodded slowly, her gaze fixed on the woman's hand. "Do you see these marks?" "That's why I'm here. What are they?" She exhaled, her expression darkening. "If I had to guess, and I'd need to examine this more closely, these look like scars from manual labor. Hard, repetitive work. Cotton fields, sugarcane plantations, maybe turpentine camps." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "But here's the thing, Marcus. Slavery ended in 1865. This photo is from 1902. So how does a black woman in the early 20th century have scars like these?" Marcus felt a chill run through him despite the warmth of the office. "You're saying she was still enslaved?" "Not officially," Evelyn said, her voice grim. "But there was a system after the war, convict leasing. Southern states arrested black people for minor offenses, sometimes for nothing at all, and leased them out to plantations, lumber camps, coal mines. It was slavery by another name, and it was legal." Marcus stared at the photograph, his mind racing. "So she could have been trapped in that system." "Yes." Evelyn looked up at him. "If you want to know her story, we need to start digging. And I think we should." 2 weeks later, Marcus and Evelyn stood in the Louisiana State Archives in Baton Rouge. surrounded by rows of filing cabinets and shelves stacked with leather-bound record books. The air was cool and dry, preserved to protect the fragile documents within. A young archivist named Daniel had helped them navigate the cataloging system, pulling boxes of records related to convict leasing, parish court documents, and plantation logs from the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Most of these records were never digitized, Daniel explained as he set down a stack of dusty ledgers on the research table. A lot of people don't even know they exist. Convict leasing wasn't something the state wanted to memorialize. Marcus opened the first ledger carefully. The pages were yellowed and brittle, filled with handwritten entries in faded ink. Each line represented a person, a name, an alleged crime, a sentence, and a destination. He scanned the lists, his eyes moving over names like ghosts calling out from the past: Thomas, Lila, Samuel, Rose. Most of the crimes were absurdly minor: vagrancy, loitering, insolence, theft of food. The sentences were brutal: 5 years, 10 years, hard labor. Evelyn sat beside him, cross-referencing the entries with census records and death certificates she had requested from the New Orleans Public Library. The system was designed to be vague, she said quietly. They didn't always record full names, ages, or places of origin. It makes it almost impossible to trace individuals. Marcus felt frustration rising in his chest. So we might never know who she was? We might not, Evelyn admitted. But we keep looking. Hours passed. The afternoon light faded and the archive's fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. Marcus was about to suggest they take a break when Evelyn suddenly straightened in her chair. Wait, she said, her voice sharp with urgency. Look at this. She slid a document across the table, a convict leasing contract from 1898, issued by the Louisiana State Penitentiary. It listed dozens of names, most of them black men and women, leased to a sugarcane plantation in St. James Parish. Near the bottom of the list, one entry stood out. Clara, female. Approximate age, 28. Sentenced to 7 years for theft, leased to Beaumont Plantation. Marcus leaned in, his heart pounding. Clara, do you think... I don't know yet, Evelyn said, already making notes. But St. James Parish is close to New Orleans. The timeline fits, and look. She pointed to a faint notation in the margin. This says she was released in 1901, 1 year before your photograph was taken. Marcus stared at the name, feeling a strange mix of hope and dread. Could this be her? The woman in the photograph? The woman whose scars had started this entire search? We need to find out more about Beaumont Plantation, Evelyn said, already gathering her things. And we need to find out what happened to Clara after she was released. The drive to St. James Parish took them through flat Louisiana countryside, endless stretches of sugarcane fields, narrow roads lined with oak trees draped in Spanish moss, and small towns where time seemed to move slower. Marcus drove while Evelyn read through printouts of historical records she had brought along. The Beaumont Plantation, they had learned, was one of the largest sugarcane operations in Louisiana during the late 1800s. After the Civil War, it had transitioned from chattel slavery to convict leasing, continuing to profit from black labor under a thin veneer of legality. The conditions were horrific, Evelyn said, her voice tight. Convicts worked 16-hour days in the fields, cutting cane with machetes. They were beaten, starved, and worked to death. Mortality rates were higher than they had been under slavery because the plantation owners had no financial incentive to keep them alive. They could just lease more. Marcus gripped the steering wheel tighter, his jaw set. And the state allowed this? The state profited from it, Evelyn said bitterly. Louisiana made millions leasing out convicts. It wasn't abolished until 1901, but even after that, many prisoners were simply transferred to chain gangs or kept in brutal conditions under different legal frameworks. They arrived at the site of the old Beaumont Plantation just after noon. There wasn't much left. A few crumbling brick structures, overgrown fields, and a historical marker that made no mention of convict leasing. Marcus parked the car and they walked through the tall grass toward what remained of the old plantation buildings. The heat was stifling, the air thick with humidity and the buzz of insects. Evelyn took photographs of the site while Marcus stood in the middle of what had once been a vast cane field. He tried to imagine Clara here, her hands raw and bleeding from the sharp cane stalks, her body exhausted, her spirit unbroken despite everything. The thought filled him with a deep, aching sadness. "Over here," Evelyn called. She was standing near the ruins of a small wooden structure, half collapsed and covered in vines. I think this was the quarters where they housed the convicts. Marcus joined her, peering into the dark interior. It was barely large enough to hold a dozen people, let alone the dozens who would have been crammed inside. The floor was dirt, the walls thin and rotting. He could almost hear the echoes of voices, the sound of exhausted bodies collapsing after another day of backbreaking labor. As they walked back to the car, Marcus noticed an elderly black man standing near the road, watching them. He wore overalls and a wide-brimmed hat, his face deeply lined with age. Marcus approached him cautiously. "Excuse me, sir," Marcus said. We're researching the history of this plantation. Do you know anything about it? The man studied them for a long moment, then nodded slowly. My granddaddy worked these fields, he said, his voice low and gravelly. Not as a slave. He was free. But he knew people who came through the convict system. Said it was worse than slavery because, at least under slavery, they pretended you were worth something. Here, you were just a number, worked till you dropped. Marcus felt a lump form in his throat. Did he ever mention a woman named Clara? The man's eyes narrowed. Clara? That's a common name, but there was a woman. My granddaddy talked about her sometimes. Said she survived 7 years here and walked out with her head high. Don't know if that's your Clara, but she was real. Armed with the new lead, Marcus and Evelyn returned to Baton Rouge and began searching for any records that might confirm Clara's identity and connect her to the family in the photograph. Evelyn suggested they check hospital and charity records from New Orleans around 1901 and 1902. If Clara had been released from Beaumont, she might have sought medical care for injuries sustained during her imprisonment. They spent 3 days combing through records at the New Orleans Public Library and the archives of Charity Hospital, one of the few medical institutions that treated black patients at the turn of the century. The work was painstaking. Most records were incomplete, names were misspelled, and many documents had been damaged by floods or simply lost to time. On the 4th day, Marcus found something. It was a patient intake form from October 1901, written in cramped, nearly illegible handwriting. Clara, colored female, approximately 30 years old, admitted for treatment of infected hand wounds. Patient reports injuries sustained during labor at sugarcane plantation. Wounds treated and dressed. Released after 5 days. Marcus's hands trembled as he held the document. Evelyn, look at this. She read it quickly, her eyes widening. Infected hand wounds. That matches the scarring in the photograph. But we still don't have a last name, Marcus said, frustrated. How do we know this is the same Clara? Evelyn was already flipping through the stack of documents they had collected. Wait, here, look at this. She pulled out a faded receipt from a photography studio in the French Quarter, dated March 1902. It was a payment record for a family portrait. Received payment from Clara and Joseph, family of 5. Full sitting and print. Marcus stared at the receipt, his heart pounding. Joseph! Clara and Joseph! He grabbed the photograph and looked at the man seated beside the woman. This could be them. It's not proof, Evelyn cautioned, but it's close. If we can find marriage records or census data from 1900 or 1910, we might be able to confirm it. They worked late into the night, cross-referencing every piece of information they had. Finally, just before midnight, Evelyn let out a triumphant shout. I found them! She pulled up a scanned image of a 1900 census record on her laptop. There, listed among hundreds of households in New Orleans, was an entry. Joseph, head of household, age 32, laborer. Clara, wife, age 28. Children, Samuel, age 8. Ruth, age 5. Daniel, age 3. Marcus leaned over her shoulder, reading the entry again and again. That's them. That's our family. Evelyn nodded, her expression a mix of satisfaction and sadness. Now we know who she was, but we still need to understand what happened to her and why she chose to keep those scars visible in the photograph. Marcus looked back at the portrait, at Clara's calm, steady gaze, and her scarred hands folded carefully in her lap. She wasn't hiding, he said softly. She was showing the world what she survived. With Clara and Joseph's names confirmed, Marcus and Evelyn began searching for descendants who might still be living in Louisiana. Evelyn posted requests in genealogy forms and reached out to local churches and community organizations in New Orleans. Within a week, they received a response from a woman named Rose Mitchell, who lived in the Tremay neighborhood and believed she was a great-great-granddaughter of Clara and Joseph. Marcus and Evelyn drove to New Orleans on a humid Saturday morning. Rose greeted them at the door of her small, brightly painted house, her silver hair pulled back in a neat bun. She invited them inside, where the walls were covered with family photographs spanning generations. The resemblance was unmistakable. The shape of the eyes, the curve of the mouth, the quiet dignity that seemed to echo through the faces. My grandmother told me stories about Clara, Rose said as she poured sweet tea into tall glasses. She said Clara was the strongest woman she ever knew. Survived things no one should have to survive, but never let it break her. Marcus showed Rose the 1902 photograph. Her eyes filled with tears as she looked at it. I've never seen this picture before, she whispered. But that's her. That's great-grandma Clara. Evelyn leaned forward gently. Rose, do you know anything about what happened to her before this photograph was taken? We found records suggesting she was imprisoned under the convict leasing system. Rose nodded slowly. My grandmother said Clara was arrested in 1894 for stealing bread. She had 3 young children and they were starving. The judge gave her 7 years. 7 years for a loaf of bread. Her voice shook with anger. They sent her to a plantation in St. James Parish. She worked the cane fields every day, sunrise to sunset. The overseers beat them, starved them. My grandmother said Clara's hands were so damaged from the cane stalks and the tools that she couldn't hold a spoon properly for years after she got out. Marcus felt a wave of rage and sorrow wash over him. But she survived. She did, Rose said firmly. She came home in 1901, and even though she was broken in body, she wasn't broken in spirit. She and Joseph saved every penny they had to get that photograph taken. My grandmother said Clara insisted on it. She wanted proof that they were a family, that they had dignity, that they were more than what the state tried to make them. Evelyn glanced at Marcus, then back at Rose. Do you know why she didn't hide her scars? Most people would have positioned their hands differently. Rose smiled sadly. My grandmother said Clara told her, "These scars are my testimony. They're proof I survived. I'm not ashamed of them." She looked down at the photograph, her fingers hovering over Clara's image. She wanted the world to see what they did to her, and that it didn't destroy her. Or, inspired by Clara's story and determined to uncover the full scope of the convict leasing system in Louisiana, Marcus and Evelyn decided to compile a comprehensive list of individuals who had been trapped in the system. They returned to the state archives and requested access to every available convict leasing record from 1870 to 1901. The project was massive. Thousands of names scattered across dozens of ledgers, contracts, and court documents. They recruited a team of volunteers, including several of Marcus's students and members of a local historical society. Together, they spent weeks photographing pages, transcribing names, and cross-referencing entries with death certificates, census records, and cemetery logs. The work was emotionally exhausting. Every name represented a life stolen, a family torn apart, a person reduced to a line in a ledger. As the list grew, patterns emerged. The vast majority of those imprisoned were black men and women, many of them arrested for trivial offenses or no offense at all. Some were as young as 12 or 13, sentenced to hard labor for vagrancy or loitering. The mortality rate was staggering. Nearly 30% of those leased out died before completing their sentences, their deaths recorded with cold, bureaucratic brevity. Deceased, pneumonia. Deceased, injury. Deceased, unknown causes. One evening, as Marcus was entering data into a spreadsheet, he came across an entry that made him stop. It was dated 1896, 2 years into Clara's sentence. Clara, female convict, hospitalized for severe lacerations to both hands, treated and returned to work after 3 days. He stared at the entry, his vision blurring. 3 days. They had given her 3 days to recover from injuries severe enough to require hospitalization, then sent her back to the fields. The cruelty of it was almost incomprehensible. Evelyn, working at the table beside him, noticed his expression. "You okay?" "No," Marcus said quietly. "I don't think I'll ever be okay with this." She reached over and squeezed his shoulder. "That's why we're doing this, so people know, so it's not forgotten." By the end of the month, they had compiled a database of over 2,000 names, men, women, and children who had been caught in Louisiana's convict leasing system. Each entry included as much information as they could find: names, ages, alleged crimes, sentences, locations where they were leased, and, when available, dates of death or release. Marcus created a website to host the database, making it searchable and accessible to the public. Within days of launching it, they began receiving messages from people across the country. Descendants searching for their ancestors, historians requesting permission to use the data, journalists wanting to write about the project. One message stood out. It was from a man in Texas who had been searching for information about his great-grandfather, a man named Samuel, who had disappeared from family records in 1895. Using the database, he discovered that Samuel had been arrested in New Orleans for disturbing the peace and leased to a turpentine camp in northern Louisiana, where he died in 1897 at the age of 24. "Thank you for giving me answers," the man wrote. "I finally know what happened to him. He deserves to be remembered." As word of the project spread, the New Orleans Museum of African American History reached out to Marcus and Evelyn with a proposal. They wanted to create an exhibition centered on Clara's photograph and the convict leasing system, using the research and database as the foundation. Marcus was hesitant at first. He worried about turning Clara's suffering into a spectacle, but Rose Mitchell encouraged him. "This is exactly what she would have wanted," Rose said when he called her. "She took that photograph so people would see. Now you're making sure they do." The exhibition, titled Testimony, Survival and Resistance in the Shadow of Slavery, opened in the fall of 2019. The centerpiece was Clara's 1902 photograph, enlarged and displayed in a simple black frame. Beside it, panels explained the convict leasing system, shared excerpts from historical records, and told Clara's story in her own words, or as close as they could come, using Rose's memories of her grandmother's stories. The database was made interactive, with touchscreens allowing visitors to search for names and read individual stories. Photographs of Beaumont Plantation, documents from the state archives, and artifacts from the period were displayed throughout the gallery. In one corner, a video loop played oral histories from descendants of convict leasing survivors, their voices filling the space with both sorrow and strength. On opening night, the gallery was packed. Historians, educators, community activists, and descendants filled the room, moving slowly through the exhibition, pausing to read, to reflect, to weep. Marcus stood near Clara's photograph, watching as people approached it. Some reached out as if to touch the glass, their fingers hovering over Clara's scarred hands. Others stood in silence, tears streaming down their faces. Rose attended with several members of her family, including her teenage grandson, who stood transfixed in front of the photograph. "That's my great-great-great-grandmother," he whispered, his voice filled with awe. "She's real." Evelyn gave a speech that evening, her voice steady but emotional. For too long, the history of convict leasing has been buried, erased, treated as an uncomfortable footnote. But it wasn't a footnote. It was a continuation of slavery, a system of exploitation that lasted decades after emancipation. Clara's photograph is a window into that history. Her scars are evidence, her dignity is resistance, and her story, like the stories of thousands of others, deserves to be told. As the evening wore on, Marcus found himself standing alone in front of the photograph. He thought about the journey that had brought him here, the dusty attic, the archives, the fields of Beaumont Plantation, the names in the ledgers. He thought about Clara, a woman he had never met but felt he knew intimately, whose strength and resilience had reached across more than a century to change his life. "Thank you," he said softly, his words meant for her alone. In the months following the exhibition's opening, the impact of Clara's story rippled outward in ways Marcus and Evelyn hadn't anticipated. Schools across Louisiana began incorporating lessons on convict leasing into their curricula, using the database and exhibition materials as primary sources. Journalists from national publications wrote articles highlighting the system's brutality and its lasting effects on black communities. Lawmakers in the state legislature, prompted by advocacy groups, introduced resolutions formally acknowledging the state's role in perpetuating the system and calling for further research into its victims. Marcus received hundreds of emails and messages, some from descendants who had found their ancestors in the database, others from people who simply wanted to express gratitude for bringing this history to light. One message came from a high school student in Atlanta who wrote, "I never knew about convict leasing before. Learning about Clara made me realize how much history we're never taught. Thank you for making sure she wasn't forgotten." Evelyn, meanwhile, was approached by several universities and research institutions interested in expanding the project. She began working with a team of graduate students to extend the database beyond Louisiana, documenting convict leasing systems in Alabama, Mississippi, Georgia, and other southern states. The work was painstaking, but it was also essential. Each name recovered was a life acknowledged, a story reclaimed from obscurity. Marcus continued teaching, but his approach to history had fundamentally changed. He no longer relied solely on textbooks and sanitized narratives. Instead, he brought primary sources into the classroom, photographs, letters, ledgers, and encouraged his students to engage with history as something alive and urgent, something that still shaped their world. One afternoon, a student named Jamal stayed after class to talk. "Mr. Jefferson," he said hesitantly, "I looked up my family history after your lesson on convict leasing. I found my great-great-grandfather's name in the database. He was leased to a coal mine in Alabama and died there in 1893. I didn't know anything about him before." Marcus felt a familiar ache in his chest. "I'm sorry, Jamal. That must have been hard to learn." "It was," Jamal said. "But I'm also glad I know, because now I can remember him. He's not just a name anymore, he's my ancestor, and I want to make sure people know what happened to him." Marcus nodded, his throat tight. "Then tell his story. That's how we honor them." Back at home, Marcus kept Clara's photograph on his desk, where he could see it every day. It was no longer just a family heirloom. It was a reminder of resilience, of the power of bearing witness, of the importance of confronting difficult truths. He thought about Clara often, imagining her sitting for that photograph in 1902, her children beside her, her husband's hand on her shoulder. She had survived the unimaginable, and she had insisted on being seen, not as a victim, but as a woman of dignity and strength. One evening, Rose Mitchell called him. "I wanted you to know," she said, "that our family is planning a reunion next summer. We're going to gather everyone we can find, Clara and Joseph's descendants from all over the country, and we're going to make copies of the photograph for everyone. Because of you, we know our history now. We know where we come from." Marcus felt tears prick his eyes. "That means everything, Rose. Thank you." "No," she said softly. "Thank you." You gave Clara her voice back. 2 years after discovering the photograph, Marcus stood once again in the Louisiana State Archives. But this time he wasn't alone. He was leading a group of 20 high school students through the stacks, teaching them how to research primary sources and uncover hidden histories. The students moved carefully through the rows of filing cabinets, their expressions a mix of curiosity and solemnity as they handled documents that were more than a century old. History isn't just something that happened a long time ago, Marcus told them. It's alive in these records, in these photographs, in the stories your grandparents tell you. And it's your responsibility to preserve it, to learn from it, and to make sure the people who suffered aren't forgotten. One student, a girl named Destiny, held up a convict leasing ledger. Mr. Jefferson, this says a woman named Sarah was sentenced to 10 years for using offensive language. How is that even a crime? It wasn't, Marcus said. It was an excuse. The system needed laborers, so they arrested people for anything, or nothing, and leased them out for profit. It was slavery with a different name. Destiny's face hardened. That's not justice. No, Marcus agreed. It's not, and that's why we have to tell these stories, so it never happens again. Later that evening, Marcus drove out to St. James Parish. He had visited the site of Beaumont Plantation several times since that first trip, and each time he felt the weight of history pressing down on him. But tonight was different. Tonight, he wasn't there to mourn. He was there to remember. He walked through the overgrown fields, the tall grass swaying in the warm breeze. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the land where Clara and thousands of others had labored, suffered, and survived. Marcus thought about her scars, about the way she had chosen to display them in that photograph, refusing to hide the evidence of what had been done to her. He pulled out his phone and looked at the digital copy of the photograph he always kept with him. Clara's face stared back at him, her expression calm and resolute. Her hands, scarred and strong, rested in her lap, a silent testimony to everything she had endured. You won, Marcus whispered. They tried to erase you, but you're still here. Your story is still here, and it always will be. As he walked back to his car, Marcus felt a profound sense of peace. Clara's story had been forgotten for more than a century, buried in attics and archives, overlooked and ignored. But now it was known. Now it mattered. And because of her courage, thousands of other stories were being recovered too, names pulled from obscurity, lives acknowledged, histories reclaimed. The photograph that had started it all now hung in the New Orleans Museum of African American History, where visitors from around the world could see it, learn from it, and carry Clara's story forward. It was no longer just a family portrait. It was a symbol of resistance, survival, and the unbreakable human spirit. Marcus got in his car and started the engine, glancing one last time at the fields where Clara had suffered. The past couldn't be changed, but it could be remembered. And in remembering, there was power. The power to honor those who came before, to learn from their struggles and to build a future where such injustices would never be repeated. Clara's scars had become her testimony, and now, through Marcus's work, the testimony would echo through generations, a reminder that even in the darkest times, dignity and humanity endure.